Excellent. It's so very, very good to see virtually the Reverend Canon Jeremy Haselock, a very good friend of St. Timothy's, dear friend of mine and so many in this parish. And we're going to spend some time today because at St. Timothy's, starting in Lent, we are doing a book study on the Wednesdays in Lent on a book called The Sacrament of Easter. And I want to introduce that just for a moment. The Sacrament of Easter, and I have two copies. I have an old original copy that I found on eBay for 99 cents. This
Oh,
is what I paid for it.
yes. I
And
knew I was worth something, but
absolutely. And the Sacrament of Easter was first. So I found this history interesting. So I want to talk about because I actually find this is the 60th anniversary of the first printing of this book, which is remarkable,
uh,
1965 to 2025. And that's the original 1965 version.
that's the first edition. Yes.
I think, and I want to talk to you about this in a little bit. I think that the atmosphere liturgically and the changes that were going on that prompted Father Greenacre to write this book are in some ways parallel to the revision that you've done, which is a pretty substantial revision now in 2025. So I want to spend just a moment to talk about why he wrote this book. So my understanding is Father Roger he was, and you can fill in the gaps. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury's student at the Catholic University in Belgium. Is that correct?
Louvain. Yes. Hmm.
And so there, in the early 1960s, he was in the ground zero for a lot of the major movers of the liturgical movement.
Well, the Periti were already briefed on what was going to happen, and they were preparing preparatory papers for all sorts of documents that were eventually going to come out of Vatican II. But Roger was there really talking to the liturgists and the liturgical theologians. So he soaked up the preliminary atmosphere of Vatican II before it had even got together.
And if
And
one,
in the light of that, coming back, he was invited to preach a series of Lent sermons at St Mary's Bourne Street and also at Marble Arch. And the great Professor Eric Maskell, professor of theology at King's, at London and perhaps the greatest Thomist of his day, heard Roger's sermons and said, "Look, this is really important material, and can you work it up into a book?" And so in 1962, Roger delivered the lectures. In 1965, they published the book. And that same year, he went off to Paris to be the chaplain at St. George's Parish, the Anglican chaplain in Paris. But the book, published by the Faith Press, came out at that time. Now, interestingly, the manager, the director of the Faith Press, the editorial director, was a man called Ronald Jasper, who was in fact the secretary and then the chairman of the Liturgical Commission at that time. So he read Roger's book at an early stage, which is quite an interesting thought, because he then went on to produce the alternative service book, which had absolutely no provision whatsoever for the celebration of Holy Week and Easter. That's just a sideline. But that's a bit of the background to the actual original writing of the book.
well, let's go back a little bit further to explain just for a moment the context of what
Yeah.
of what's going on before Vatican II. And so when I said liturgical movement, maybe a good shorthand way to understand, because it's a complex thing, was a movement to bring more awareness, understanding, and involvement of the people into the liturgies of the church.
Yeah.
In many ways, a catechetical movement to explain this great gift that we have in the drama of liturgy that forms us in Christ. And so there were specifically, we can talk about what happened in 1951 and 1955 with Holy Week revisions. You
Well,
mentioned,
I think it's quite important to note that
yes,
that
absolutely.
is actually where it started. I mean, we understand and see the Paschal Mystery as the absolute heart and center of our Catholic faith, and also how it's best embodied in the liturgy. So it was an act of great wisdom on the part of the Holy Father of the day to actually inaugurate the slow revision of the liturgy by looking at Holy Week. And as you can probably remember from your reading of the book, the process was gradual,
Yes.
but gained momentum in the years leading up to the Second Vatican Council, and was then picked up and run with as the sort of model for subsequent revision.
And what people may not realize is, I mean, first of all, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer has no Holy Week provision at all,
Well, there are the Easter anthems on Easter Day.
but nothing for Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and certainly no prelude
No,
that.
but the Passion readings are remain from the Sarum Missal. Cranmer and the subsequent reformers kept that on. So there's an embryonic Holy Week or a survival Holy Week, but it's only represented by the Passion readings and by the Easter anthems on Easter Day and a proper preface for Easter Day.
Indeed, and what you get at in the book is that even though we're talking about the 1662 prayer book and, of course, the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, which would have been active in force at that time,
Still
also
no material.
very limited, but also in the Roman Catholic Church, the experience of Holy Week was perhaps as limited as it would have been in most Anglican Episcopal parishes, because the liturgies were taking place in the morning, especially Maundy Thursday, which is the Last Supper at night in the morning. The Easter Vigil, we all associate now with evening, would have happened in the morning. And my understanding is the reason why basically it was in the morning was partly for practical reasons to have light to be able to do the liturgies. But the point was it was so disconnected from one another, perhaps, as a sort of a unitive, organic expression of the Paschal mystery, which we'll get into in a moment. But also it was difficult for the people to participate themselves. And
Well,
so
I don't think they wanted to. I
yeah,
mean, because these were perceived to be, and to a great extent were, clerical activities. This was an activity of the clergy and a select number of the requisite choir and servers, and they went on, and the clergy were the laity were aware of them, but their paschal devotions were limited to the Stations of the Cross, and to devotions rather than the liturgy. And the clergy, with not much degree of enthusiasm, got on with the actual Holy Week services.
so that's the background in the 1960s that Father Roger was reflecting on of a sort of a desert of understanding of the liturgies of
Yes,
Holy Week.
The Pian reforms had to a certain extent ameliorated. At the times of the liturgies had been changed, though the actual texts were still much as they had been, and one or two well-formed lay people were beginning to take an interest in them, but they still were very poorly attended, and the significance of them for actually incarnating, if you like, enfleshing our participation in the Paschal Mystery was had escaped most people, but of course it hadn't escaped the liturgical theologians of the first part of the 20th century and the very late 19th century. They had started to recover this sense of the absolute crucial importance of the Paschal Mystery and were agitating for reform of the liturgy, which is why the Pian reforms took place and why the momentum for subsequent liturgical reform started at that point.
And for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, Pian refers to Pope Pius XII, who was the
Absolutely, Pius XII, who first authorized the reform of the Holy Week liturgies.
so what I love about this book, and I just finished a review for the Living Church, and the thing that I commented on was every year someone comes to me and asks, what is a good book they could read during Lent for their Lenten devotion. And when I reflect on what I could recommend, they tend to fall into two very different categories. One is really scholarly works that aren't suitable for any kind of devotional reading or any engagement with a renewed life that we are seeking in the Lenten journey. On the other hand, they may be so overly sentimental and geared toward um, sort of almost Pelagian acts to make the world a better place. And again, nothing to do with our renewed life in Jesus
Mm.
Christ. This book, I think, is unique in that I think it offers something to the specialist, it offers something to clergy, and it offers something to the laity, which is why I think is actually appropriate for a parish book study.
Yeah.
Because what I really appreciate, even though we're talking now about the history of the liturgy, which may be interesting for a select group of people, it has profound importance into our experience and our formation in the faith. But what Father Roger does and what you amplify is he actually begins with a biblical theological study as to what is the point of this liturgical expression, and that is the Pascha, the Paschal mystery, which you define or he defines as and sort of helps us think about it by talking about passage. Do you want to reflect about the transitus, the passage of what it means of, and he has chapters of the Passover of the Jews, the Passover of Jesus Christ, and the Passover of the Christians are the three chapters that he started that you amplified. Do you want to comment about the three kinds of Passover that we see in those three groups?
Well, first, it's a bit like chicken and egg, isn't it? The first thing you notice when you experience the Paschal liturgy, whether in the old form or in the new form, is the heavy reliance on Old Testament imagery. Therefore, in other words, the Pascha, the Passover that we celebrated, is absolutely rooted in one of the foundational experiences of the Jewish people. And all the movement that takes place in the liturgy is inspired by the movement of the people of Israel out of Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the discovery of the Promised Land, and the settling into the Promised Land. That provides the background to nearly all the imagery. Even St. Paul takes that up in Romans, and the parallels between the crossing of the Red Sea and the and baptism and things all become very apparent. Now, and here one has to be a bit careful about whether Christianity, we the Christian people, are the new Israel or parallel. I don't want any sort of supersessionism to creep into what I say, but the fathers, the early fathers who had no such scruples about supersessionism, truly believed that these things were types of the one great Passover, the great Pascha that was going to happen in the passion, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. They were shadows, if you like, but types and shadows have their ending, and the Pascha that we celebrate derives its symbolism, its imagery from the experience of the people of the Hebrews, but is actually realized to the full in the Passover of Christ. So the chapter on the Passover of the Jews explores the Old Testament references to Passover and what actually was going on. Now, I'd like to make a little footnote here. The Last Supper was not a seder at which the Old Testament parallels were rehearsed. The Seder was probably compiled by the Jews in reaction to early Christian liturgy, Paschal liturgy, and would never have been heard of, let alone celebrated in Christ's time. And so I want to put that as a footnote because many people have been misled into thinking that a good way of spending Maundy Thursday is to have a Christian Seder or a Christian Passover meal. first of all, I think it's hugely disrespectful to the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition, but also it's totally historically anachronistic to do it. Anyway, going back to the book, the chapter.
You say, quite simply, it is important to realize there can be no such thing as a Christian Seder. That's again, yeah. Go on, please.
So that the chapter of the Passover of the Jews explores all that Old Testament background and the Paschal expectations of the Jewish people. And again, as I said before, explores the imagery of the crossing of the Red Sea and the like. The Passover of Jesus Christ, of course, actually asks the question about what Jesus was doing by his self-offering on the cross at Eastertide. And again, it uses the language of passing over, of crossing, of movement to explain exactly what he was doing. He came from the Father and he was going back to the Father. And he was going back to the Father, taking upon himself the need, human need, for salvation. So that transitus, that Passover, was absolutely vitally important. And the third chapter, the Passover of Christians, explores how through the liturgy, through the exploration of all the scriptural themes, Christians have actually continue to participate in that transitus, in that Passover. We pass over from death to life through baptism, through our participation in the Paschal mystery, because Christ takes us and our humanity into the very heart of the Father. That is our Passover.
And these chapters are very important because they do provide that biblical theological foundation that then
Yes,
that
but
then
also they help you understand the liturgy because
absolutely.
why choose the readings that we choose for Lent, remembering the preparation of the catechumens for baptism at Easter? Why choose those readings for Lent? Why choose those readings in Holy Week itself? It's really important to see how rooted they are in the experience of God's chosen people.
And people will appreciate that not only is it a good biblical exploration, but you weave in history of art. People, for instance, always ask about the skull at the base of the cross in our central panel in the triptych. You go through the Golden Legend, you weave in art and music and other things that amplify these themes that we may be familiar with or may have seen, but didn't realize that they are also speakers that help amplify the proclamation of our passage from death to life in Jesus Christ.
I've always been particularly moved by the skull and crossbones beneath the foot of the cross. It's always, since I was a lad, really, I've first of all wondered why they were there. Nearly all devotional representations of Christ crucified have them at least hinted at or explicitly there. And it wasn't till I read the John Donne poem and then decided to read the Golden Legend did I understand. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff about the cross. I mean, the cross was made of timber that was actually the bridge across which the Queen of Sheba went to see Solomon. I mean, there's all sorts of funny things. It was grown from a pip that came from the apple that was eaten at the temptation. The pip was planted by Cain and Abel, and from that grew the tree. I mean, it's an extraordinarily rich and complicated set of images. But the crucial point is that at the end, hanging on the tree of life, which is so often shown as green in medieval manuscripts, it's not the dark wood of the cross, but the green living wood of the cross. So important is that it was planted over the skull of Adam, over Adam's tomb. And as the blood trickled down from Christ's wounded side, so it poured over Adam's head, metaphorically, if not literally, and actually the second Adam redeemed the first.
With the foot
You
of the
can
cross, you have
understand
Eve and the new Adam. They're together. Yes.
absolutely, and you can immediately understand the harrowing, the importance of the harrowing of hell, which we think of as happening during that great liturgical blank on Holy Saturday morning. But it all makes so much sense when you think that here is, I mean, the medieval mind, the patristic mind, loved the circular. They loved things that were cyclical. And these things all go in this huge, great circle. And that which began with Adam's disobedience takes its huge circle and ends up with the blood of Christ trickling down over his skull and crossbones, and Christ going down into the limbus patrum and seizing their hands and dragging them out into his eternal presence.
And in addition to your revisions to those three chapters of the Passover of the Jews, Jesus Christ, and Christians, you add two more, one on the mystery of the cross and then passion and resurrection, which are very helpful. So between those five chapters, before we even get into the full exploration of the liturgies, even though those liturgies are referenced throughout the work, you really do come away with a very solid and deep presentation of really the whole Christian message summed up and the reflection for anticipating the Holy Week liturgies. And that's why I say that it's really there's something there for the specialist, the scholar to reflect on, the clergy, which we'll get to in a moment. But I do think that I don't want people who may hear this or come to the book study think this is a liturgical history that really may be interesting to a select few, but not to the whole. That I think is really the heart of the book and what makes it so unique among all other books that one could read during Lent. Now, I think the second part, though, on the actual liturgies of Holy Week contains some of the greatest revision because the last revision, of course, was 1995, 30 years ago, and now we've had so much liturgical reform. Not so much in the Episcopal Church because we haven't added a lot to the official liturgy since 1979, but certainly in the Church of England. And whereas Father Roger was there anticipating Vatican II with his exposure to the great figures in the liturgical movement, you were in ground zero, as it were, on the liturgical renewal in the Church of England, because you were steering the committee that actually compiled, revised, and published the liturgies that the vast majority of Christians in the Church of England will use in Holy Week and Easter with common worship, correct?
Correct.
And so you not only are writing about this as someone who's observed the revisions and renewals, you had a real hand in making that happen. So when you were doing those revisions as the
Can
chair,
I just go back a little bit,
yes,
very, very quickly? The reason we wrote the subsequent editions of Roger's book, we wrote them, was because the Liturgical Commission of the late 70s and early 80s were very well aware that the ASB, the Alternative Service Book, which marked the first really big liturgical step forward for the Church of England, had no pastoral material in it at all. It was just basically
1980. When did that come out?
it was ASB 1980.
So 1 year after the American Prayer Book.
That's right, and heavily influenced by the American Prayer Book. It has to be said, and it's important to say that. But very rapidly, this lacuna was understood by members of the Liturgical Commission, and they immediately began work on a book called Lent, Holy Week, Easter, which was a set of provisions for exactly that, for the liturgies of Lent, Holy Week, and Easter, providing all the material that Rome had started to use, that the American Prayer Book had hinted at, and was felt to be necessary. That having come out, Roger decided, and I concurred, that we needed to rewrite the book, incorporating the Lent, Holy Week, Easter material. It had always been our intention, eventually, when the ASB ran out of its time and the Common Worship project was going to begin, that we would do a final edition of the book, incorporating all the stuff that had been done to produce the Common Worship Holy Week liturgies. But we noticed at the same time that there was movement in the Roman Church, in a conservative direction at the time. The Methodists had had a good look at their liturgical books and seen that they needed to make more provision. America had produced one or two supplementary pamphlets and books to assist with Holy Week and Easter. And the Ordinariate had taken into, as it were, the Roman system, a whole lot of traditional language liturgical material, which embodied the Vatican II reforms, but rendered it in a language which would be of interest and acceptable to many English-speaking worshippers. Um, so it was high time for a revision, and I reproach myself that we never managed to do it well in Roger's lifetime, though he did leave a file of notes. But it seemed to me that not just as a memorial to Roger, but as a really important tool for people to understand the new liturgical revision, it was time to completely revise the book. Other point I want to make, and you've probably picked this up from your reading of it and comparing it with the previous edition, the first four editions, Roger's original text and the three Gracewing publications, all retained the slightly sermon kind of delivery that Roger had put into his first work. In other words, it addressed people as if from the pulpit or the lectern. And I decided that one of the ways of actually of opening up the text was to remove all references to we and you and all that sort of thing, so that it could be read not as a set of sermons expanded, but as a book which had a sort of literary coherence to it. You may have noticed that. I also rearranged the order of the chapters to I think you've already spotted that, to give the book two very distinct sections, the theological undergirding and then the actual practical outworking of that in the liturgy. It also identified, the book also identifies early on that this material is not easy, and that congregations need to have it presented to them in a beautiful, tidy, and well-organized way. Otherwise, they're going to think, oh, at the Easter Vigil, this is so chaotic and this is so long, and I don't think we're going to come. Let's go on Easter Day, and miss out on what is the sort of liturgy of Catholic Christianity. And so it was important to put as many hints as possible. You're probably going to come up to discussing this, but as many hints as possible as to how to do this beautifully and why it is done and why, therefore, it needs to be done beautifully.
Yep. Let's come back to that because I think maybe one of the most important lines in this, I think, is at the end of part one, and or almost at the end of part one. And you say this. This may have been Father Rogers' original that you amplified. It says this book. I'm sorry. It says the Sacrament of Easter demands from the believer a total commitment. Christians are called to live the liturgy of these days in such a way as to lay themselves open to be assimilated into the mystery it celebrates. The faithful must so fully enter into the transitus of Christ to the Father that they celebrate at the same time their own passage to the Father. To enter deeply into the fellowship of Christ's sufferings is to know fully and joyfully the power of his resurrection. And what I appreciate, and this is where I think there was a real shift to away from the specialist, away from the clergy, but to the person who is curious about Holy Week or is a person who's been very faithful but wants to deepen their understanding, is that you say a couple of things, a couple of themes that are renewed with each chapter. This is vitally important to the Christian's identity and understanding of their life in Christ. You say Holy Week is of utmost importance to the Christian, but you also say that it demands much. It demands attention, it demands time, and you also turn that to the clergy. You tell the clergy not to entertain, but also at the same time, don't make it boring and dull. To sort of thread that very, very fine needle, which is very important. But so the onus is on both the clergy and the laity together to give themselves totally in commitment to this, which is going to require work and time and sacrifice, because it is that important to do, to experience and to do well, so that what it presents may actually be alive in us. And I want to caution or say to those who read it, I found, in terms of the specialist things, your reflection on the lectionary that we have in Lent and Holy Week helpful and illuminating to sort of see how the themes continue to repeat? Because as the Roman Catholic lectionary was borrowed by the Church of England, it's the same as true in the Episcopal Church. We all have the same lectionary on this. And I don't want to spoil all of it because I want people to read the book and I want them to come to the study. But I do want to, you mentioned, I do want to talk about what are maybe some obvious errors or ways in which, because in the 1960s, if Christians in the West haven't experienced Holy Week really fully before in a way that they could participate and understand, now 60 years later, and certainly 40 years since 79 and 80, we have a Holy Week experience in almost all of our churches, but it may not be the best experience. It may not have been the best presentation. What do you think are some of the grave errors that churches, not meaning to, not maliciously, but have fallen into some bad habits or practices that take away from the best expression of Holy Week?
The point of liturgy is to take the holy people of God and bring them right into the very heart of what they're commemorating, what they're doing. It's an immersion experience. That means that the material that you give them, as it were, to work with in the pew must be accessible. It must be beautiful, it must be well rendered and everything, but it must be accessible. And it must be clearly understood that what we're doing there is not an entertainment. It's not a play acting. And there's a danger here, which goes right the way back to Egeria's experience of the Holy Week liturgy in Jerusalem, where things were acted out in the various locations. There's a danger that temptation to want to do that is still there, but adapted to modern times. So there are distractions which do not need to be there. For example, and you'll laugh at this because the donkey is totally superfluous to Palm Sunday. It is nothing but a distraction. Now, some people will say, oh, well, we've found in various museums around the world a model of Christ sitting on a donkey on little wheels, which was sort of towed along. And if that was the case in the Middle Ages, then why don't we have a real live donkey now? But it was a distraction then when it was trundled along on a set of wheels. It's not the important thing. And my experience of parochial Palm Sundays, where there has been a donkey, is that everybody has gone away from the liturgy saying, what a sweet donkey, and not actually seen that the great gates of Holy Week and the celebration of the Pascha have been thrown open on Palm Sunday, and a very carefully crafted liturgy which moves from the procession of palms into a meditation on the Passion, which prefaces the rest of Holy Week, is completely knocked for six by the fact that you've got a donkey who misbehaves or poos in the church or digs its hooves in or whatever, or is petted by the kids afterwards.
Let
Now
me stop you
that's
there.
one mistake.
So you'll be happy to know that I looked for a donkey this year. I've never used one and I couldn't find one.
Good.
But talk about, because I think this is actually very important. Talk about, this is probably where you're going next. Palm crosses and palm branches.
Yes. Ever since the Middle Ages, things that were given to you in church, like a palm or a candle or an Agnus Dei, were treated with a sort of, they were sacramentals, and they were treated with a reverence that meant that you brought them home and you put them in your family shrine or near your crucifix or whatever. And they took on a significance which was partly good because they reminded you of the occasion on which the thing was given, but also they distracted because they came slightly superstitious. And the candles on St. Blaise's Day meant that you didn't get a cold or cough through the rest of the year and all this sort of stuff. The point of the Palm Sunday procession is that not that you take away with you a piece of desiccated, twisted palm leaf, but you actually hail the arrival of the Messiah as he enters into Jerusalem, the city where his transitus is going to be acted out. And that, yes, you can take a bit of it home if you want to afterwards, but you don't make the actual be all and end all of the first part of the Palm Sunday liturgy, the distribution of things to take home. It's actually your participation in the procession. That's why it's important to have the procession starting outside or in another venue, and that the branches are actually held already by the by the congregation and blessed by being hand. I don't know if you remember the old blessing of palms from the liturgy. I mean, it was like a sort of Holy Communion service, except you didn't
Absolutely. Yeah.
consecrate. You
Absolutely.
didn't consecrate hosts. You consecrated things. It had a preface and everything. It was a sort of dry mass, and the matter of the mass were these desiccated bits of frond. Now that completely missed the point. And the reform of the liturgy has actually reinforced the point of the first part of that. So, yes, all right, give people, bless some thingamies and have them in a basket for people to take home if they want to, but encourage them to bring their own greenery, just as the people of the Hebrews bearing branches of olive went out to meet the Lord, as the sung antiphon says, so that they are actively participating in this first part of the liturgy.
So
And
I'm
this engages people in a way that solemnly distributing blessed dried palm leaves doesn't do at all.
watching the time, so I want to reflect on four things that this book has influenced Holy Week experience in this parish in the past and coming forward, and then if there's any reflections on those that may be helpful. So now I'm sort of speaking to clergy, how they might be formed by this. One is, I think your argument is absolutely convincing of the greatest participation of all people on Palm Sunday to enter together in Holy Week. So we're only having one Mass on Palm Sunday, so we can have one great Palm procession and not be stressed about timing to get it done so we can do the next one and all of that. So we're only having one, which I think is very important. And I couldn't find the donkey. So that's one thing that we're doing. The other thing that we are doing is on the Easter Vigil, you make a convincing case. And this is hard. Now, what I appreciate about the tone of your book is that even though you have a certain churchmanship that's similar to, my own churchmanship, you're not mandating that to the reader that they have to follow a certain liturgical expression. And I think that's a fair approach. But you also say that the Easter Vigil, for instance, is not going to compete with Christmas. It's just not. And you say, I'm not sure we should even try to do that. That being said, having the Easter Vigil at the same time as Midnight Mass is very, very difficult to achieve. But you say it's really nonsensical to have the blessing of light and the new flame in a bright church. It loses all symbolism. So, for instance, what we're doing this year is, because we're doing it certainly in the evening, but because of where we are in the globe and when the sun sets, we've ordered blackout curtains to be placed in the church so that when we come in, it will actually be dark because of our windows. So, sort of an artificial evening. The other one is the funny one that you chastised me years and years ago. And I think people, I don't want them to read this part actually, and then to blush and think that's silly because I did it first.
I know what you're going to say.
I know the impregnation of the waters of baptism with the Paschal candle is really a moving image, and so the funny thing is that you fussed at me for having the candle follower on top of the candle. You said let the wax flow. You don't want to put a prophylactic on the impregnating force of the Paschal candle in the font. So if people don't know what we're talking about, in the vigil when you bless the waters of baptism and bless the font, you place the Paschal candle in the font three times to bless it. And I mean, people need to sort of grow up and get over the middle school reaction. It's a powerful, important image. And the other thing that I've done, which goes against sort of my traditional adherence to the rubrics, and I also think this is a very, very important point you make, is the importance of the integrity of the Great 50 Days. And speaking of the Paschal Candle, of not extinguishing it on Ascension Thursday, which is, the sort of the traditional time to do it, because Easter's not over. And so reclaiming the importance of Pentecost, which I think is, of all the things that you mentioned, reclaiming the sort of the climax of Pentecost is a challenge because I think the themes have been lost and the theological importance has been lost. So those are four just quick examples of how the text from the Sacrament of Easter has formed the liturgical practice here.
Well, I can't say anything other than I'm very pleased to see how you've taken on board the importance of these things. Just to comment on one of them, Pentecost. The idea of Pentecost having an octave is an utter nonsense because it's the consummation, it's the end, it's after the 50 days. And what we've tried to do in common worship was to have a novena before Pentecost. So if you, instead of having your octave, you've got the 9 days between Ascension Day and Pentecost as a build-up. And these need to be skillfully used by the clergy to prepare people for the Pentecost, which is a huge, as it were, affirmation of all that's gone before, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the disciples to finally convince them of the validity of what they and the meaning of what they've been through and what they've experienced, and the presence of the risen Lord in their lives is suddenly all is, as it were, sealed. Sacramentum, I mean, sealed by the gift of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And you can make Pentecost into a big day, ending up with a solemn evensong and reaffirmation of baptismal commitment or even baptisms. It's really important that our understanding of our celebration of the Paschal Mystery begins on Ash Wednesday and ends on Palm Sunday, on Pentecost Sunday.
I think that's the place to end because that's the main purpose of the book is the organic whole of the Sacrament of Easter spans all of those, and that is what one would take away from it. Is
Can I
pub
just make one point which is relevant to that? I know we're running out of time, but I do want to stress the organic whole of Thursday evening, Friday, and Saturday night. This is not three separate services. This is one service, one liturgical action divided into three parts.
Mhm.
And it's very important to teach that to people. They're not say, oh, well, we'll come on Maundy Thursday and we won't come on Good Friday, or we only come on Good Friday, but we won't come on to the. This is one great liturgical action. And you do well to prepare people for that in your Lenten preaching, that this is I always preach about it on Palm Sunday. I said, what you're entering into now, you must not abandon at any stage.
The book is published by Gracewing in America. It's probably easier to find it on Amazon, and I look forward to doing the study. We may call you back up again to have some further reflections after we do this. It'd be a fun exercise as a group of people come together to talk about this work and what it means and what they've learned and how they're
Well, I
how
should be very interested to hear what people's reactions are. That would be fascinating.
good. Father, thank you very much.
Not at all. It's a huge pleasure.